Please be seated. The sitting is open. The court meets this afternoon to hear the Russian Federation, France, the Gambia, Guyana, and Hungary on the questions submitted to it by the United Nations General Assembly. As I have had the occasion to note, each delegation is kindly requested to keep to the maximum speaking time of 30 minutes for its presentation. This afternoon, the court will observe a short break after the presentation of the Gambia. I shall now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation, His Excellency, Mr. Vladimir Tarabrin. You have the floor, Excellency.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, it's an honor for me to be representing the Russian Federation at these hearings. Seizing this opportunity, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, Madam Vice President, and all the new judges of the court upon election to your respective positions. We trust that the court, in its new composition, will continue making its immeasurable contribution to peaceful resolution of disputes and development of international law. Mr. President, the current proceedings originate in the adoption by the General Assembly of Resolution 77/247 back in December 2022. When adopting the resolution, the General Assembly was gravely concerned by the tension and violence in the recent period throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. The Assembly noted the continuing systematic violation of the human rights of the Palestinian people by Israel, the occupying power, including that arising from the excessive use of force and military operations causing death and injury to Palestinian civilians. The Assembly also spoke of the arbitrary imprisonment and detention of Palestinians, the use of collective punishment, the closure of areas, the confiscation of land, the establishment and expansion of settlements, the destruction of property and infrastructure, the demolition of Palestinian homes, the forced displacement of civilians, and the disastrous humanitarian situation and the critical socio-economic and security situation in the Gaza Strip. As has been stressed by numerous delegations speaking at these hearings, the situation on the ground has since deteriorated in a dramatic fashion. The Gaza Strip, since October 2023, has been an area of intense hostilities. This time, violence has taken an unprecedented and indeed a catastrophic scale. The overall number of victims during the current wave of violence, almost 30,000, has already surpassed the figure from any of the previous Arab-Israeli wars. Images from Gaza are terrifying. Indiscriminate airstrikes are killing civilians and erasing whole residential districts. More than half of all buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed. Up to 90% of Gazans have been forced to leave their homes and are living in inhuman conditions. Against the backdrop of the tough Israeli blockade, the Gaza Strip is experiencing a genuine humanitarian catastrophe. Its inhabitants are suffering from an acute shortage of food, medication, and fuel. Access to sources of clean water has been limited, resulting in a spread of infectious diseases. Over 20% of agricultural lands have been damaged and will never be recultivated. Mr. President, Russia, of all countries, understands the dangers of terrorism. We have faced this evil time and again. Let me use this opportunity to reiterate our heartfelt condolences to the Israelis who lost their loved ones in the attack on the 7th of October. Brutal massacre of innocent people taking of hostages, and other terrorist violence do not have and cannot have any justification. We have repeatedly condemned such acts. Let me also stress that Russia highly values the stable relations that we enjoy with Israel. We are united by shared history of combating Nazism, as well as by a myriad of present-day human ties. Our cooperation is resilient in the face of geopolitical turbulence, and we are committed to its further development. Having said this, we are convinced that the tragic events of the 7th of October cannot justify the collective punishment of more than 2 million Gazans. We cannot accept the logic of those officials in Israel and some Western countries who try to defend the indiscriminate violence against civilians by referring to Israel's duty to protect its nationals. Violence can only lead to more violence. Hatred brings hatred. This vicious circle must be broken. In Russia's view, security both for Israel and the Palestinians can only be ensured if the root cause of the current crisis is addressed. Outbreaks of violence will inevitably occur again until the Palestinian people, having suffered for decades from injustice, exercises its right to establish an independent state. That state, in accordance with the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, is to emerge within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Only this approach, based on international law, can bring a lasting peace for the region and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. This is the spirit that we have, that has been guiding Russia in fulfilling its responsibilities as a mediator between Palestine and Israel, notably as a member of the so-called Quartet, alongside the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union. The history of the conflict shows what happens when Security Council resolutions are ignored and influential global actors are incapable of or unwilling to help the parties find consensual solutions. Attempts to put the conflict into a low-intensity mode instead of a comprehensive settlement have time and again provoked eruptions in the occupied territories. The current wave of violence is no exception. It was preceded by a persistent policy of the United States and its allies aimed at freezing the status quo, watering down the political processes, promoting a one-sided vision of a settlement. Among the victims of such short-sighted and irresponsible approach was the quartet of mediators, those of mediators whose work has been effectively blocked by the United States. This flawed policy of Washington has predictably led to a failure that has cost thousands of innocent lives. Today, all responsible members of the international community are facing a difficult task of creating conditions to lead the situation out of the current impasse. After the violent phase has been overcome, the parties will need help in establishing a full-fledged political dialogue, allowing them to settle all disputes on the universally recognized international legal basis. Russia hopes that the advisory opinion of the court will contribute to achieving this goal. Mr. President, a lot has already been said in this hall on the numerous violations of international law by Israel. Russia supports the assessments given in the General Assembly Resolution 77/247 and the respective reports of the Secretary General. We also support relevant resolutions of the Human Rights Council based on the reports of its special rapporteur. In today's statement, let me focus on two of the most important aspects. First, the first one is the persistent denial by Israel of the right of Palestinians to self-determination. The right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent Palestinian state has been at the heart of efforts of the international community. This right has been recognized by the General Assembly, the Security Council, and by this court. It's worth recalling that the principle of self-determination of peoples is one of the foundations of the United Nations, mentioned in the very first article of its charter. Every state has the duty to refrain from any forcible action which deprives peoples of their right to self-determination. Meanwhile, as recognized by the General Assembly, the protracted Israeli occupation prevents the Palestinians from implementing that right. An end to the Israeli occupation has been identified as a goal for the international community by legally binding resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Israel is accordingly under an obligation to cease its violations of international law and to allow the Palestinian people to establish an independent state. This necessarily means that the occupation must come to an end. The other key problem that leads to continuous violations of human rights of Palestinians are the Israeli settlement activities. This policy, sometimes referred to as creation of facts on the ground, was launched back in 1967 and has led to progressive shrinking of Palestinian lands. This has effectively undermined prospects of a negotiated solution of the one element of the final status, namely the issues of territory and borders. The overall number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is over 700,000. The situation is exacerbated by other arbitrary moves by the Israeli authorities, such as confiscation of lands, demolition of homes, and prohibition of new construction. Most recently, this has been accompanied by violence emanating from Israeli settlers. In 2023, that is after the present request for an advisory opinion was made, the settlement activities of Israel have gained a record-breaking high speed. Thus, according to the latest reports of the United Nations Secretary General, in 2023, plans for more than 700,000 housing units were advanced, approved, or tendered. This is more than double than 11,700 units in 2022, which in itself was a remarkable figure. During the current wave of violence, we have witnessed public statements by Israeli cabinet members announcing plans to resume settlement activities in the Gaza Strip. Thus, on the 28th of January 2024, at a conference in West Jerusalem, cabinet ministers openly called for deportation of Palestinians from Gaza and presented a map with 21 settlement blocks. One cannot help noting that the event was held 2 days after this court indicated provisional measures in the South Africa versus Israel case. The court agreed that the situation in Gaza poses risks of irreparable harm to the rights of Palestinians guaranteed by the Genocide Convention. This fact alone underscores the gravity of the situation. In this connection, it's worth recalling that this court, in its advisory opinion on the wall, recognized that the Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, had been established in breach of international law. As explained in that advisory opinion, the settlements are contrary to the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. They also contradict the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibiting transfers of population and deportations from an occupied territory. Resolutions of the Security Council have characterized that policy as changing the legal status and geographical nature of the occupied territories and materially affecting their demographic composition. In its resolution 2334, the Security Council reaffirmed that the settlements have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievements of the two-state solution and the just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. This policy is aggravated by numerous violations of other rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law. These include the right to life, to respect for private and family life, to property, to freedom of movement, to freedom of religion, to work, to health, to education, and to an adequate standard of living. As mentioned earlier, this policy continues unabated in defiance of Security Council resolutions and the Quartet roadmap. Importantly, as stressed in Resolution 2334, the settlements are dangerously imperiling the viability of the two-state solution based on the 1967 lines. They are thus also violating the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Israeli policies in Palestine, to Russia's deep regret, include other international law violations. Many examples have been provided by other delegations here. The Russian Federation expects the court to give them due consideration. Mr. President, members of the court, the question before us, therefore, the legal consequences of those violations. The starting point here is the well-established rule whereby every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. In the present proceedings, the court will be right to conclude that Israel's violations result in Israel's duty to comply with the obligations it had breached, to put an end to its ongoing violations, and to provide reparation for the damage caused. This means, first and foremost, that Israel is under an international legal obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to stop all settlement activities in the occupied territory. Given the particular legal framework in the Middle East peace process, Israel is also under an obligation to cease all activities that impede reaching a final status agreement based on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination in an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Having said that, the court will be wise not to engage in a detailed discussion on the precise scope and forms of implementation of Israel's responsibility. This is important for two reasons. First, advisory proceedings before the court are not an exercise in implementation of responsibility. No state is invoking Israel's responsibility in these proceedings, as indeed Israel is precluded from invoking responsibility of others. A state may only be brought before this court on the basis of its own consent. Full respect for the principle of consent is a crucial importance for the integrity of international judicial procedures. Secondly, the international community has established a solid legal framework for the Middle East peace process. This legal framework is a universally recognized and a legally binding one. It contains crucial elements that effectively coincide with the aims of international responsibility. A negotiated two-state solution with an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state peacefully coexisting with Israel will be the best recipe for bringing an end to Israel's violations, creating guarantees of their non-repetition, and redressing the damage. The advantage of the peace process is an idea of direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine. They are to reach an agreement on the basis of their free will. In Russia's opinion, that significantly strengthens the chances that an agreement will actually be achieved, will indeed satisfy the interests of both parties, and will be implemented in practice. The Russian Federation invites the court to be guided by the need to contribute to creating conditions for successful final status negotiations. The best contribution would be a confirmation by the court that Israel and Palestine are under an obligation to resume such negotiations, while all states and international organizations shall cooperate in order to make that possible. In its written statement, the Russian Federation has discussed the status of the court as one of the principal organs of the United Nations. The court has on many occasions recognized that its advisory opinions represent its participation in the activities of the organization. When asked by the General Assembly to provide an advisory opinion, the court should give an opinion that would indeed be useful for the Assembly. For these reasons, we respectfully submit that the court, when giving an advisory opinion in this case, should be guided by the principles of the peace process and should actively seek to give an opinion that would contribute to their implementation. Mr. President, today I will not dwell upon issues of jurisdiction, admissibility, applicable law, or interpretation of questions put by the General Assembly. The respective chapters of the written contribution of the Russian Federation retain their full relevance. Let me now summarize our submissions. The continued Israeli occupation of Palestine impedes the realization of the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination. Israeli settlements are contrary to the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. They also run counter to the prohibition of transfer and deportation of population of an occupied territory. The settlement activities are aggravated by numerous other violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. All states are under an obligation not to recognize the illegal situation resulting from Israel's violations. Israel shall terminate its breaches of international law. It must, in particular, cease all settlement activities and all other activities that impede reaching a final status agreement. At the same time, discussion on Israel's responsibility must remain within the limits imposed by the advisory nature of these proceedings and to the need to create conditions for successful final status negotiations. Israel and Palestine are under an obligation to conduct in good faith and without delay negotiations aimed at reaching a final status agreement. All states and international organizations are under an obligation to contribute to creating conditions for such negotiations. The agreement thus reached shall result in the implementation by the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination and emergence of an independent, viable, and contiguous Palestinian state, with East Jerusalem as its capital. This will bring an end to the ongoing violations of human rights of Palestinians and to the Israeli occupation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for its presentation J'invite maintenant la délégation.
I now invite the next participating delegation, France that is, to address the court. And I call on Mr. Diego Colas to the podium. Sir, you have the floor. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, it is a signal honor for me to represent my country before you. Allow me in introduction to return, if I may, to the very consequential context of these audiences, of these hearings. 7th October 2023, Israel underwent a terrorist attack of unprecedented scale. France condemned this in the strongest possible terms, the attack perpetrated by Hamas and the other terrorist groups, and expressed its full solidarity with Israel and the victims of said attack. Now, as did the court in its order indicating provisional measures of 26 January 2024, France called for the immediate and unconditional freeing of those hostages kidnapped by Hamas and the other terrorist groups during the attack on Israel in October. France would also like to recall the right of Israel to defend both itself and its population, to ensure that such attacks as these do not occur again in the future. But this right has to be exercised in full compliance with international law, and specifically in compliance with international humanitarian law. When Israeli bombing and military operations created thousands of civilian victims in Gaza, France asserted this requirement time and again, clearly and steadfastly. The protection of civilians and aid workers is both a moral imperative and an international obligation. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law, which dictates at all times and in all occasions clear principles of distinction, necessity, proportionality, and precaution. Let me add that the compliance with international law, and specifically international humanitarian law for all parties involved, gives the only possible outlook for peace. France took note of the concerns expressed by the court in its order of 26 January as to the fallout of military operations which are taking place in the Gaza Strip. The court's concerns regarding, I quote, the extent of the human tragedy unfolding in the region and the human suffering which we continue to deplore can only be shared by my country. As the French Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs recalled during its intervention, the Security Council of the United Nations on 23 January, we must work forthwith towards a ceasefire, a sustainable and durable ceasefire which alone will put an end to the sufferance and the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza. By handing down an advisory opinion in the instant proceedings, the court can make a valuable contribution to the just and durable settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Indeed, an opinion could usefully contribute to the clarification of the framework and legal parameters applicable to this situation. It will then fall to the parties involved, supported, of course, by the international community, to seek a negotiated solution for lasting peace consistent with international law. In this respect, France repeats its unwavering support for a negotiated two-state solution, coexisting side by side within secure and recognized boundaries based on the lines of 4 June 1967, both having Jerusalem as their capital. Indeed, for France, only a two-state solution will meet both the right of Israelis for security and to the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians for a viable, contiguous and independent state, living in peace and security alongside Israel. To this end, France calls for a decisive and credible restarting of the peace process. The current situation in Israel and Palestine raises a large number of questions of international law, but only some of them are raised by the questions posed by the General Assembly. And in France's opinion, it is vital that the scope of the instant proceedings be precisely delineated. It will thus be the task of the Court to provide the General Assembly with an opinion which, while shedding light on the legal questions posed, goes no further than is necessary to do so. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, seen holistically and following the order of questions put to the Court, my statement will deal on the 5 following points. First of all, right to self-determination, occupation, colonization and annexation, discriminatory laws and measures, the status of Jerusalem, and legal consequences. Before diving into these 5 points, I would like to make an initial observation on applicable law. To have a comprehensive view of the legal framework relevant to the request for this opinion, it should be pointed out that Palestine has become a party to a number of multilateral treaties since 2004, which was since your opinion, with a non-exhaustive list that can be found in our written comments. First, self-determination. The right of the Palestinian people to self-determination was recalled by the Court in its opinion of 2004. The Security Council has also reiterated this on numerous occasions. The existence of a Palestinian people within the meaning of international law is no longer a matter of debate. As such, like all peoples, they enjoy the right to self-determination. Pursuant to this law, to rehearse the terms of Article 1 shared in both the 1966 covenants, all peoples freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. That's a quotation. Thus, regarding the Palestinian people, this right, first of all, has a political dimension. This dimension, broadly enshrined by various General Assembly resolutions, it is characterized by the right to an independent Palestinian state, and by the right of the Palestinian people to exercise their sovereignty over their territory and to accede to independence in their state. This perspective fits fully within the vision of a region in which 2 states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side within recognized and secure boundaries. Any solution for peace will necessarily first require security arrangements being concluded between Israelis and Palestinians, providing concrete and efficient guarantees. At the same time, these security guarantees can only exist if in future a real Palestinian state exists, able to conclude such arrangements and ensure their compliance. That's to say, a state capable of exercising full sovereignty within its internationally recognized boundaries. In this context, France is of the opinion that any action running counter to the necessity to preserve the unity, continuity, and integrity of the entirety of the OPT, including East Jerusalem, is a violation of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. From this point of view, the continuing occupation, but also the development of settlements and the fragmentation resulting from these settlements, undermines the creation of a viable state of Palestine. The longer the attacks to the integrity of the OPT continue and increase, the further the perspective of such a state recedes. More fundamentally, the continuation of those breaches attributable to Israel threatens the possibility for the Palestinian people to effectively exercise their right to self-determination. To this end, the finding by the Court in 2004 remains, but the passage of time is not neutral. It hampers the perspective of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination being realized. Just about 20 years after the advisory opinion handed down by the Court on the legal consequences of the building of a wall in occupied Palestinian territory, the multiplication of measures accompanying it and the development of settlements create an equal number of barriers to the self-determination of the Palestinian people. Okay, my second point now. Let me come to the question of occupation, colonization and prolonged annexation of the Palestinian territory occupied by Israel since 1967. Now, 2 points here. First, the legal consequences of the prolonged character of Israel's occupation, then the question of whether this extended occupation, together with the question of colonization, implies an ongoing violation. Well, occupation is a de facto objective situation characterized by one state exercising effective control over a given territory. Since the end of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel can be considered as the occupying power of West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, within the meaning of Article 42 of Hague Regulations from 1907, relative to laws and customs of war. This de facto situation, noted by the Court and by the UN Security Council, assumes that the international norms of provided for in case of occupation, military occupation, will be applied. These norms establish the rights for the occupying power inter alia to maintain security, not compromise military needs. But above all, they impose positive obligations, of which the principal is the protection of populations subject to occupation. In this respect, the Security Council and the General Assembly have recalled a number of times the obligations of Israel under the Fourth Convention of Geneva relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. That's 12 August 1949. These international norms apply independently of the lawfulness which enabled the state to exercise its effective control over the occupied territory. They apply whatever the length of occupation, even though essentially occupation should be considered as being temporary. The obligations of protection apply, to rehearse the terms Article 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, during the duration of the occupation. With occupation of Palestinian territories lasting since 1967, the prolonged character seems difficult to justify by the necessity of war within the meaning of Article 23G of the Hague Regulations of 1907. Indeed, circumstances justifying occupation during the period following immediately military operations, may not be invoked several decades after these operations have ceased. That's what the Security Council and General Assembly to ask the Israeli armed forces to withdraw from these territories a number of times in numerous resolutions. In France's opinion, the indefinitely prolonged character of an occupation is contrary to the fact that this should be, by very nature, provisional. Occupation is a de facto question which gives rise to a specific legal regime. The fact that it is prolonged in itself doesn't mean that it's wrongful. But the danger here would be a finding of wrongfulness which would lead to this regime no longer applying. That itself would lead to a result which is manifestly absurd and unreasonable, where civilian populations would be deprived from the protection offered by the regime, a protection that's all the more necessary the longer the occupation continues. Uncertainty on the applicable legal framework is all the more prejudicial in the current context of Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip, territory over which Israel now exercises reinforced control. In this territory today, the affected civilian population must absolutely and necessarily, at the very minimum, be entitled to enjoy the rules of protection provided for by the occupation law.
Turning to my second point, the link of the colonization policy of occupied Palestinian territories. Colonization of occupied territories, contrary to Geneva Convention's Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention provides, and I quote, occupying power cannot deport or transfer part of its own civilian population in the territory that it occupies, end of quote. The Security Council on several occasions condemned this situation. In its opinion, 2004, the court also concluded that, I quote, the Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem were established in breach of international law, end of quote. This state of unlawfulness remains all the more grounded that since 2004, Israel's continued accelerated its policy establishing or extending settlements in occupied Palestinian territories. On this question, France reiterates its firm condemnation of the illegal settlement policy by Israel, particularly in the current context. This of Palestinian families and destruction of properties must see war in Gaza in no way constitutes a pretext to continue to impose on the ground unilateral measures that undermine the prospects for a two-state solution, the only one that can guarantee a just and lasting peace. In a joint statement, 15 December 2022, France reiterated its position pertaining to the settlement policy illegal under international law. Recalled Israel the obligations incumbent upon it under international law, particular Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. France also firmly condemned violence committed by extremist settlers who terrorize Palestinian communities, end of quote.
Sur ce dernier point,
on this latter point, France has taken measures on a national basis against certain violent Israeli settlers and stated that it supported the adoption at European level of sanctions against them. Furthermore, it needs to be recalled that the status of an occupying power confers absolutely no legal title justifying an annexation. In this regard, the fact that occupation is particularly prolonged can in no case legitimize the annexation claims. Quite the contrary, one of the cardinal principles of international law is that prohibiting this form of annexation, as this emerges from Resolution 2625, no territorial acquisition obtained through the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal, end of quote. In this context, an annexation of a territory that would seek to be based on the extended nature of occupation can only be considered as null and void under international law. Thirdly, the question posed by the General Assembly also relates to the legal consequences of discriminatory laws and measures adopted by Israel. In France's view, this question refers to the laws and measures applied to occupied Palestinian territories, but in contradiction with the international regime provided for occupied territories. The laws and measures that present a discriminatory nature contravene not only the provisions cited of the conventions of The Hague and Geneva, but also international texts in terms of human rights that bind Israel applicable to occupied Palestinian territory. France notes that international humanitarian law doesn't necessarily exclude that a differentiated status may apply to the population of an occupied territory. Status cannot, however, justify the adoption of laws and measures that would be discriminatory. As the court set out in its 2004 opinion, protection offered by HR conventions do not cease in the case of armed conflict. The right of occupation must therefore be implemented taking into account applicable human rights law. The occupying power is in particular required to exercise rights and duties by taking into account the obligation of non-discrimination, which stems notably from Article 2 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The question posed to the court also relates to the measures aimed at amending the composition of the demographic composition of the territory. France's view is that international law clearly prohibits the implementation by the occupying power of measures that would modify the demographic composition of the considered territory. In this regard, France reiterates its condemnation of pronouncements promoting the installation of settlements in Gaza and the transfer of the Palestinian population of Gaza outside this territory. France recalls that the court set out the obligation for Israel to take all measures in its power to prevent and punish such statements like in the West Bank or elsewhere. Such a modification of the demographic composition of the Gaza Strip would indeed constitute a serious violation of international law, both conventional and customary. Fourthly, Mr. President, members of the court, I now come to the question of the status of Jerusalem. Through many of its resolutions, notably Resolution 478 of 1980, the Security Council affirmed the internationally wrongful nature of measures taken by Israel to amend the status of Jerusalem, including the basic law of 30th of July 1980 that proclaims Jerusalem as one and indivisible as capital of Israel. Resolution 478 of 1980 recalls the adoption of this basic law does not challenge the application of the Fourth Geneva Convention. There is therefore no doubt that the unilateral status imposed by Israel and Jerusalem is null and void under international law. Furthermore, the protective measures set out in the Fourth Geneva Convention must apply to Jerusalem as in the remaining occupied Palestinian territories. Thus, the expropriation of Palestinian land in East Jerusalem, but also the status which applies to Palestinian in East Jerusalem, constitute a breach of the obligation of the occupying power to take such protective measures. In effect, it's not just the military measures that contravene Israel's obligations and occupying power, but also the measures of Israeli civilian law applied to Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Israel, under international law, is more broadly required not to adopt legislative or other measures aimed at modifying the status of Jerusalem. As recalled in the Presidential Declaration of the Security Council of 20th of February 23, France considers it necessary to maintain unchanged the historical status quo on holy places in Jerusalem. Fifthly and finally, the request for an advisory opinion of General Assembly covers the legal consequences arising from the violations of international that might be noted by the court. In this regard, it's useful to recall that in its 2004 opinion, the court responded by distinguishing the legal consequences from Israel and those for the other states, and where appropriate for the United Nations organization itself, the same will apply for these oral observations. As regards Israel, the first legal consequence is the obligation of cessation of what is wrongful under Article 30 of Articles 2001 of the ILC on the state responsibility for international wrongful acts. The state responsible for a wrongful act is under obligation to put an end to it if that act continues. An examination of the situation in occupied Palestinian territory reveals continuous violations of international law to which Israel must put an end. These violations relate, as we've seen, to the people's right to self-determination on international humanitarian law and international human rights law applicable to the situation in occupied Palestinian territories. Are notably concerned the transfer of Israeli population as part of the illegal settlement policy conducted by Israel and the discriminatory or restrictive measures of certain rights and freedoms of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories. This obligation must be called with even greater force that in the context of the current tensions, the settlement policy is doubled with an increase of violence committed against Palestinians in the West Bank. The obligation of cessation has both legal as well as material consequences. As part of the current proceeding, the cessation obligation requires that policies and practices that violate international law must end. Also implies the rescinding of domestic legal acts on which they're based, as well as positive action to uphold international law. The second legal consequence stemming from a violation of international law is reparation. As part of the current request for an advisory opinion, France considers this reparation obligation extends to all damage caused to the Palestinian population resulting from Israel's policies and practices that don't comply with international law. As a general rule, the reparation obligation must, as far as possible, take the form of restitution, and failing that, compensation if restitution no longer possible. As regards violations of the Palestinian people as a whole, collective or symbolic forms of reparation should be considered. Lastly, in respect of satisfaction, Israel would be required to conduct investigations and prosecute, where appropriate, persons responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law committed in the occupied Palestinian territories. As regards the other states, the court had already noted in its 2004 opinion the erga omnes nature of international obligations breached by Israel during the construction of the wall in occupied Palestinian territories. As part of this request for an advisory opinion, the same situation applies regarding the infringement of people's rights to self-determination regarding from the prolonged occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory, as well as policies and practices implemented in occupied Palestinian territories. There results for all states an obligation of non-recognition of a situation that is a grave breach of international law. No form of annexation, including partial, can be recognized under international law. In this regard, in the occupied Palestinian territories, as everywhere else, France will never recognize the illegal annexation of territories. Upholding the international status of occupied Palestinian territories also carries with it effects from the economic standpoint. We'll recall in this regard that in Resolution 2334 of 2016, the UNSC requested all states to distinguish in their dealings in this regard between the territory of the State of Israel and occupied territories since 1967. This leads, in the case of EU law, the inclusion of international law in the opinion of the court in 2004 in order to distinguish products depending on their origin. As regards the United Nations organization, it could, as was the case, set out where appropriate the follow-up to be given to the opinion of the court regarding the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the risks of undermining the international status of occupied Palestinian state, notably guarantees offered by the status to the Palestinian population. Lastly, it must be recalled the court had requested in 2004 the United Nations as a whole to redouble its efforts to rapidly bring an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to establish a just and lasting peace in the region. This request to embark on peace negotiations between the parties, supported by the international community, remains more than ever relevant. France is ready to provide its support, all efforts undertaken in this regard. Mr. President, members of the court, I thank you for your attention.
Je remercie la délégation de la France pour son exposé.
I'd like to thank France's delegation for its presentation.
The Gambia to make its oral statement before the court. I thus call upon His Excellency Mr. Dawda Jallow to take the floor.
Mr. President, honorable members of the court, it is an honor for me to appear before you to present the Republic of the Gambia in these essential advisory opinion proceedings. As was the case with the Gambia's written statement, my oral submission today focuses on the second question presented to the court regarding the legal status of the occupation and the legal consequences that arise therefrom. The preamble of the UN Charter reminds us the fundamental goals of our international system: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of human persons, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress, better standards of life, in large freedom. Mr. President, members of the court, notwithstanding the great resources invested by the international community at large, none of these goals have been achieved for the Palestinian people. None of them. And none of these goals can be achieved for the Palestinian people until Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories is brought to an end. My remarks today will focus on 3 points. First, I will discuss the fact that a belligerent occupation can be illegal per se under certain circumstances. Second, I will set forth 3 reasons why Israel's prolonged occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal, a view shared by a substantial majority of the states participating in these proceedings. Third, I will conclude by emphasizing the essential role of this court in declaring that Israel's occupation is illegal and must be brought to an end immediately. As the court knows quite well, the international system is based on certain fundamental principles of law, which includes peremptory norms of international law or jus cogent norms. Adherence to these norms is not subject to derogation, and compliance with them is owed erga omnes to the international community as a whole. Some of the recognized jus cogent norms include prohibition of aggression, prohibition of genocide, the prohibition of apartheid, and the right to self-determination. If a particular action of a state violates one or more jus cogent norms, that action is illegal under international law. Any state may invoke the responsibility of that state for such a violation and seek an immediate end to it. This is fundamentally the situation regarding Israel's occupation in the Palestinian territories. The international community, collectively over many years, has found Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories to be illegal, among other reasons on account of its violations of multiple jus cogent norms. And collectively, we have invoked Israel's responsibility in that regard to end the occupation. Mr. President, at least one state in the course of these proceedings has suggested that an occupation under international law cannot be illegal under any circumstances. This argument posits that an occupation exists, therefore it's legal. The proposition is unfounded in international law and fails for several reasons. First, this argument confuses jus in bello and completely ignores the jus ad bellum. As the court is well aware, international humanitarian law and the jus in bello is the body of law that governs the ways which warfare can be conducted. It includes within it the law of occupation, a body of rules regulating the conduct of occupying power. It is indeed true that the obligations under jus in bello, as they relate to an occupation, persist throughout the pendency of the occupation. But separate from jus in bello is the jus ad bellum, or the conditions under which state may resort to armed force. It is the jus ad bellum that addresses the legality of use of force, including an occupation, which is maintained by ongoing use of force. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter prohibits the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. The only exceptions to this prohibition are the very narrow circumstances of the force authorized by the UN Security Council or self-defense under Article 15 of the Charter. Any use of force outside of these narrow exceptions, that is, any any annexation or occupation of territory arising from an act of aggression or otherwise unlawful use of force is illegal. Any use of force that is unnecessary, disproportionate to the threat against which it is exercised is also illegal under jus ad bellum. Second, the proposition that an occupation exists, therefore it is legal, also ignores the existence and implications of jus cogent norms going beyond the jus ad bellum. If an occupation inherently violates one or more jus cogent norms, then it is illegal as a whole, and the occupying power's responsibility for that violation can be invoked in order to bring the violation to an end. The occupying power's ongoing obligation under international humanitarian law do not and cannot preclude the wrongfulness of jus cogent violations inherent in the occupation itself. For example, the argument that occupations are inherently legal, if adopted, would directly conflict with and undermine the prohibition on the annexation of territory. Any state that wanted to de facto annex a territory could do so by indefinitely occupying that territory, but not formally incorporating it within its borders. It is the same with the jus cogent norms of the rights of self-determination. Simply put, flagrant violations of international law cannot be brushed aside by the fig leaf of occupation. Finally, the thesis that an occupation exists, therefore it is legal, also ignores the fact that the court has determined occupations to be unlawful in the past. As discussed in the Gambia's written statement, this was the case regarding South Africa's occupation of Namibia without title, and regarding Uganda's occupation of the Congolese province of Ituri. The UN Security Council and the General Assembly have characterized occupation resulting from unlawful uses of force to be illegal as well. In sum, a belligerent occupation can be illegal per se if it violates the jus ad bellum and other jus cogent norms. Mr. President, members of the court, the Gambia will highlight 3 reasons why Israel's prolonged occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal. All 3 of these reasons, the right of self-determination, the prohibition on apartheid, and the jus ad bellum, reflect obligations rooted in jus cogent norms. This conclusion of illegality is shared by a substantial majority of the participants in these proceedings, many for the same reasons as the Gambia. First, Israel's occupation violates the right to Palestinian people to self-determination and is therefore illegal. Their government's right of self-determination is one of the essential principles of contemporary international law and jus cogent norm enshrined in the UN Charter. The court has before its extensive and uncontested fact-finding, the court has before it extensive and uncontested fact-finding multiple UN mandate holders, including the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Occupied Palestinian Territory and the many reports of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. These reports have been produced by independent UN mandate holders who engage in extensive fact-finding utilizing multiple sources of evidence. The court should accept these reports as conclusive and convincing evidence of Israel's long-standing, ongoing, and indefinite infringement on the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. Indeed, there is no end in sight to Israel's occupation. Already extending over 56 years, Israel's current leadership boasts with pride its long-standing efforts to prevent the creation of an independent Palestinian state. As reported by the UN Special Rapporteur, Israel's occupation violates Palestinians' ability to organize themselves as a people, free from alien domination and control. No derogation is permitted from respecting the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. There is no escaping the conclusion that Israel's occupation is illegal for violating the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, and that it must expeditiously be brought to an end. Second, Israel's ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territories is also illegal because it amounts to a regime of apartheid, the prohibition of which is a peremptory norm of international law. This court has described apartheid as flagrant violation of purposes and principles of the Charter. Once again, the court has before it extensive, credible, and independent fact-finding demonstrating conclusively that Israel has imposed an apartheid reality in the Palestinian territories. This is clear in the reporting of the UN Special Rapporteur, who concluded that Israel has imposed upon Palestine an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. This is also reflected in the findings of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Senior international leaders like Ban Ki-moon, Desmond Tutu, and former Israeli officials, including former Attorney General, former Director of Israel's Intelligence Service, Sin Bet, and former Ambassador of Israel to South Africa, have also concluded that Israel's occupation constitutes a regime of apartheid. The most credible non-government human rights organizations that report on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory have also concluded that the occupation is, in fact, and in law, apartheid regime. A sober review of the uncontroverted evidence convincingly shows that the occupation is a regime of apartheid. As such, Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal and must urgently be brought to an end. Third, Israel's 56-year occupation of Palestinian territories violates the laws on the use of force, jus ad bellum, and is illegal for that reason as well. As discussed earlier, the prohibition on the threat and use of force as a jus cogent norm, even then resort to force is justified by self-defense in response to an armed attack. The particular force used may still be illegal if it is unnecessary or disproportionate to the threat against which it is exercised. Israel launched the June 1967 war that led to its occupation of the Palestinian territory. After its surprise attack initiating the war, Israel occupied all remaining Palestinian territory in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, as well as Syria, Golan Heights, and Egypt in Sinai Peninsula, effectively tripling the size of the territory under its control. Since this use of force was not taken in response to an armed attack and was not necessary or proportionate even if it had been, the occupation was flagrant violation of the laws of the use of force from the onset. Furthermore, even if the occupation of the Palestinian territories were lawful at one's time, its continuation for more than 5 decades means that it could not possibly still be lawful today. First, the use of force in self-defense is only justified within the strict confines laid down in Article 51 of the Charter and does not allow the use of force by a state to protect perceived security interests beyond those parameters. As such, essentially, preventive use of force are beyond the scope of Article 51. Second, as clarified in the World Advisory Opinion, Secondly, as clarified in the World Advisory Opinion, Article 51 does not apply to situations involving conduct taken in response to purported threats emanating from the within occupied territory. Israel therefore cannot justify its occupation as a response to illegal threats emanating from within the occupied Palestinian territory itself. Israel's ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territories also violates the jus ad bellum because its maintenance is unnecessary and disproportionate. It is simply not possible that it has been necessary for Israel to maintain its occupation since 1967 for over 56 years. Moreover, Israel also cannot possibly justify its settlements upon an annexation of occupied territory as a necessary response to any perceived threat, not to mention the myriad of rights violations that are intrinsic to the occupation. By settling and annexing occupied territory, Israel has acted unnecessarily in using force. Israel's prolonged occupation is also wholly disproportionate to any legitimate aim. Israel's occupation of the entirety of the Palestinian territories, long after the period in which they presumed armed attack could reasonably be contemplated, makes it even more disproportionate now. And the manner in which the occupation has been conducted, including the establishment of an apartheid regime, renders the occupation disproportionate as well. In sum, Israel's decades-long occupation violates the jus ad bellum and is therefore illegal. Mr. President, members of the court, in the almost 20 years since the Wall Advisory Opinion, Israel has only deepened the occupation. Israel has annexed more territory and expanded its illegal settlements. It has further fragmented the Palestinian territory. In Gaza, Israel has decimated the territory and the Palestinian population there. In the territories overall, Israel has entrenched an apartheid regime. The Palestinian people continue to be deprived of their right to self-determination indefinitely. And all the while, there is no justification under international law for Israel's continued use of force to maintain the occupation, if there ever was one to begin with. Mr. President, members of the court, I remind us of the fundamental goals of the United Nations that I recited at the beginning of my remarks. If we are to ever achieve any of those goals in regard to the Palestinian people, then this court must play its role in robustly answering the question posed by the General Assembly. As to the second question posed, the Gambia submits that the court should find Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal per se for all of the reasons discussed. And the Gambia further submits that the court should find that Israel, all other states, and the United Nations are under an obligation to bring about an end to Israel's occupation immediately, or at least as rapidly as possible. Thank you, Mr. President, members of the court, for your kind attention.
I thank the delegation of the Gambia for its presentation. Before I invite the next delegation to make its oral statement, the court will observe a break for 10 minutes. The sitting is suspended.